My name is Kristen Alberg, and I am a historian in the Office of the Historian, U.S. Department of State, and the immediate past president of the Society for History in the Federal Government. Unfortunately, our president could not join us this afternoon, so I am going to be introducing our speaker. And thank you to Jesse and to Mandy for managing the technical aspects of this chat. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. David Hamilton Golland. He is a professor of history, coordinator of humanities, and president of the Faculty Senate at Governors State University. He holds a PhD from the City University of New York and a Master of Arts degree from the University of Virginia. His books, Constructing Affirmative Action, The Struggle for Equal Employment Opportunity, published by the University Press of Kentucky in 2011, and A Terrible Thing to Waste, Arthur Fletcher and the Conundrum of Black Republican, published by the University Press of Kansas in 2019, garnered positive reviews in the American Historical Review, the Journal of American History, and the Journal of Southern History, among others. Additionally, A Terrible Thing to Waste is the 2020-2021 Washburn University I Read selection. Dr. Golland has also published articles in California History, Critical Issues in Justice and Politics, the Claremont Journal of Religion, and the American Historical Association's news magazine, Perspectives on History. I am delighted that you are joining us this afternoon, David, to discuss affirmative action and the Philadelphia Plan. So whenever you're ready, please begin.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for that warm introduction. And thanks also, I join Kristen in thanking Jesse and Mandy for the technical assistance. I'll just jump right in. I think the plan of attack, as we say, is should be about 20 minutes or so of me giving some background on the work, and then hopefully opening it up to a robust Q&A discussion. So, Arthur Fletcher, the most important civil rights leader you've probably never heard of, was born into poverty in 1924 and went on to advise 5 presidents, developed the first major affirmative action program, and coined the phrase, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." Along the way, he served in Europe under General George Patton, was the first Black player for the Baltimore Colts, and endured incredible hardship when, after being run out of Kansas for his connection to a corrupt politician, his wife jumped from the San Francisco Bay Bridge in 1960 and left him a single parent of 5. Fletcher's remarkable comeback included a remarriage and 1965 relocation to Pasco, Washington, to run a Great Society program. In 1967, he became the first Black city councilman in any city in Washington state since the 19th century, although technically that was a tie. Another individual was elected in Seattle that year. And the following year, he mounted an improbable bid for the Republican nomination for lieutenant governor. He won the primary in every county in Washington state, campaigned with former child actress Shirley Temple, and had a young Ted Bundy as his driver, and lost to the Democratic incumbent. But moderate Republican Governor Dan Evans introduced him to Richard Nixon, who made him Assistant Secretary of Labor for Employment Standards. In June 1969, Fletcher ordered implementation of the Philadelphia Plan, the first federal affirmative action policy. The Philadelphia Plan came under attack from Americans across the political spectrum, inside and outside of government. When the United States Senate was considering a vote to make it illegal, Fletcher worked with Nixon to successfully defend it. But when hard hats construction workers rioted in New York to protest anti-war demonstrations, Fletcher's favor in the White House fell. Nixon transferred him to the United Nations delegation under the supervision of George Bush. After that, he led the United Negro College Fund, where he supervised the rollout of the signature advertising phrase, as I said, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste," returned to the White House during the Ford administration, made an unsuccessful run for mayor of Washington, D.C. against Marion Barry in 1978, and chaired the United States Civil Rights Commission during the first administration and into the Clinton administration. His funeral in 2005 was attended by Maryland Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele and Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, while the eulogy was delivered by the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who later again came to fame as during the 2008 presidential campaign. In approaching the story of this larger-than-life, blustery ex-football player, I visited the libraries of the presidents he served, visited the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and did a couple of FOIAs. Then I hit the proverbial motherlode. Fletcher's son, Paul, had his dad's papers in 150 moldering in the back of a truck trailer on the grounds of an auto repair shop. For 3 weeks in Hollywood, Florida, he and I sweated over these boxes, sorting and digitizing them with the help of a high-speed scanner and a team of volunteers. These copious sources, more than 24,000 documents, provided the scholarly foundation for my telling of Fletcher's adult life, and I'm still working on them in conjunction with his alma mater, Washburn University in Topeka, where we are working to make them available online. So what I'd like to do with the balance of my introduction today is focus on 2 moments in Fletcher's life where oral history was instrumental in piecing together the story. The suicide of his first wife in 1960 and his role in the development of the United Negro College Fund's signature phrase in 1972. In 1960, Fletcher was not yet a public person, although he did have some previous government experience in Kansas. His wife's suicide, therefore, merited barely 2 column inches in the local paper. Discussions with his children brought the causes of the event into focus. Fletcher's tenure in the United Negro College Fund was overlooked by subsequent leaders, and it lasted only a year and ended in his dismissal. So others have sought credit for the phrase, but it was Fletcher who made the final critical changes to it and supervised its launch during that first year. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen so you can see pretty much the only documentary source pertaining to the 1960 suicide. And there it is. This is from the Oakland Tribune. The date is October 3rd, 1960. Because I imagine it might be very difficult for you all to read the header up here, but the picture itself, let me just make it a little larger for you. That's the whole thing. And so it gives some description about how Mrs. Fletcher did commit suicide on the bridge, and that's basically it. And so it came down to discussions with Fletcher's 2 surviving children, and also some of his more extended family, grandchildren and such, who could pass on stories, sort of lore that they had learned over the years. And the story is so much larger than the article, just as every one of our lives is so much larger for most of us than any reporting that you would find for us in the newspaper. Go ahead and do a newspapers.com search for your own family name, for instance, and you'll know that there's so much more to the story that needs to be told. And that's certainly the case here. This devastated the family. And I was tasked in my scholarship with telling the story of Arthur Fletcher. And so while I did some discussion of how it impacted the rest of his family, I couldn't ultimately tell the story of the rest of his family because that's not the story that I was focusing on. That's not what the biography was on, and that's not what the ultimate thesis of the book was about, which was Arthur Fletcher's sort of decline of influence in the Republican Party, and at the same time the decline of influence of civil rights belief and ideology and practice within the Republican Party during I guess the last 40 years or so of his life. The family, of course, was devastated, and it imploded. The 2 older daughters pretty much immediately left. They were teenagers. One of them drifted and had an unpleasant rest of her life, unfortunately brief, dying of AIDS in the early 1990s. The other daughter did fairly well. She lived with relatives immediately afterwards, but we all deal with these sort of trauma in different ways. And in my discussions with her and with other members of the family, I sort of had to tease out their feelings while being very respectful of those very same feelings. The three sons, who were the younger of the five children, handled it in different ways with a number of similarities. Two of them also sadly met with unpleasant early ends. One as the result of disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, I believe it was, in the mid 1970s. And in fact, I have some actual documentation on that, where it happened while Arthur Fletcher was working at the Republican National Committee and George Bush was the chairman. And at one of their meetings, George Bush, who had also lost a child very early in his daughter's life, called for a moment of silence at the meeting, which was very touching. Of the remaining two children, two sons, one of them, the youngest, the sort of baby of the family, pretty much immediately started acting out in school in a way that he hadn't been doing before, and his life just got worse and worse from there. Juvenile hall led to pretty much a lifetime, a short lifetime, sadly, in and out of prison, and he ultimately fathered, I think the number is 13 children by 12 women. I hope I wrote in the book, I don't remember exactly at this point, it's been a couple of years, but with all of my discussions with the folks involved in conducting the oral histories that I did, the impression that I got was that this young man, very young at the time, 11 years old when his mother committed suicide, was searching for affection, and unable to form a true bond, which led to sort of serial relationships of this nature. And he too ultimately died, I believe it was of a drug overdose in the early 1990s. And the surviving son done pretty well. And I interviewed him multiple times. I would say he almost approaches the level of partner in the project. I interviewed him so many times, although he never scholarly direction. But we became friends in a sense, and I got to know his take on the whole thing. And he too, of course, you could tell the impact of this moment in his family history on him and how important that had been in his development. I believe he was 12 or 13 when his mother died. So the second major event that I'd like to talk about in terms of oral history, and I'm going to go ahead and minimize this so you could see this document. It's not about actual oral histories that I conducted. In this case, it was about me reading transcripts of oral histories that were conducted by Columbia University with former leaders at that time, and at the time, one current leader in the 1980s, Christopher Edley, who was then the executive director of the United Negro College Fund. But Columbia had I guess it was a graduate student project where they conducted oral interviews with a number of these folks, going almost to the founding of the fund, which I think was in the late 1940s. And these included a number of people, names that with which you are probably familiar. Vernon Jordan, for instance, who left us sadly a couple of weeks ago. The interview subjects, in this case, he had led the United Negro College Fund for a couple of years before moving over to lead the National Urban League, also in 71, the late 71, early 72. And so I read that transcript. I read, again, Chris Edley's transcript, Morris Abrams' transcript. Morris Abrams had been the president of Brandeis University and had been chairman of the fund for a time. I think there was forgetting his first name, but Dr. Patterson, who had been one of the early executive directors who remained on the board for a number of years after they launched the phrase after Fletcher's tenure as executive director on the fund. Because I was, and I was reading these transcripts of these oral histories, I was trying to piece together the truth as best as I could, which we all, that's what we all do as historians, is, we do our best with the sources that we have, and we make an informed conclusion in the end, with what we hope is some degree of veracity, but we're all aware that we're doing the best. Again, we're doing the best we can with our sources. But in this case, there was a secondary book. I think the author's name is Mary Beth Gassman, I think she's a sociologist, if I'm not mistaken. And she had written a history of the fund that came out probably at this point about 20 years ago, where although Arthur Fletcher appears in the footnotes or the endnotes, she only refers to him in the text as a temporary executive director, and she very quickly skips over his tenure, which is odd because we have in the United Negro College Fund primary documents in their papers, which are available on microfilm in a variety of libraries. I read them at the Library of Congress in DC. It's quite clear that Arthur Fletcher is the executive director when it is launched, when this phrase is first put out there by the Advertising Council. And there are other players as well outside of the fund, like that very same Advertising Council, and like Young and Rubicam, which was an advertising firm, one of those sort of Madison Avenue firms that had been linked with the fund by the Ad Council. And everyone really wants to take credit for it. I have a Google alert for the phrase, mostly because I'd like to see if anyone's talking about the book. And unfortunately, most of the time, my Google alert goes off on this phrase in my phone or on my computer. It's not about, it's about someone else coming out of the woodwork who worked at Young and Rubicam, or who worked for the Ad Council, or who worked for the fund, saying, no, it was me. I came up with it. So it seems like everyone and their cousin wants to take credit for this, and one that gave the fund in a very different direction in terms of its fundraising strategy. They moved from very large corporate sponsorships to small donations. And those of us who study politics, for instance, we know small donations have become in the past 50 years the thing. It's the way money is raised. And so why not take credit for this if you can possibly claim it? But so Arthur Fletcher was like all of those folks as well. He claimed the whole thing at various different points in his life. But then I had to hone in on what he actually said and think very carefully about what he said and look at the documentation. And what I found, and the conclusion that I ultimately drew, was that this phrase didn't come out of the mind of anyone in whole cloth. It was developed over time, mostly during the period when Vernon Jordan was the executive director of the fund, but mostly by Young and Rubicam and their staff and a couple of individuals who worked there. But by the time it got to the fund as almost a finished product, that at that point, it's quite clear Fletcher was the executive director, and he was not temporary, incidentally. Professor was absolutely wrong about that in her book. He was fully hired, permanently hired. He just happened to be fired with about 13 months later. And in that sense, we're all temporary in our jobs. But he was hired as the permanent director, and he only served for a short period of time. He was not hired as a temp or as an interim. But what it comes down to is that the phrase that Young and Rubicam seem to have provided was, "A mind is a hell of a thing to waste." I'll say that again, a mind is a hell of a thing to waste. And Fletcher, where he adds to the story ultimately, is that he had the wisdom to say, you know what, everyone on this board is the president of an HBCU, of a historically Black college or university. And most of these HBCUs are in some way affiliated with a church. And the idea that we are now going to launch this phrase with the word hell in it, and understand, even as recently as 40 years ago when this was taking place, if we were to have a talk like the one I'm giving now, I've already used that word twice openly, but I think at that point, aside from the fact that the board were very reverent folks affiliated with churches, it was not an appropriate word to say in this sort of a public forum. So I'm not sure if George Carlin included it on the 7. I haven't memorized his 7 words that you can't say on radio or television or in the New York Times, et cetera. But you really couldn't say that. And then there was this religious angle. And Fletcher basically said, we can't do that. We can't have this phrase, "a mind is a hell of a thing to waste," even though it sounds sort of tongue in cheek, and we're not actually referring to fire and brimstone, you can't let this represent the United Negro College Fund. And so he appears to be the one who, in a meeting with several people that he led, came up with the decision that they were going to go with terrible. He may not even have said the word terrible in the meeting. He may not have been the first person to do that, but he was the one, after they bandied around a bunch of different ideas, he came up with, or he agreed and decided to go with terrible. And ultimately, one of the reasons that he seems, one of the possible reasons for which he was fired, and there are several reasons for which he may have been fired, was that he went ahead and launched this without then consulting with those very same board members who were presidents of these HBCUs about the phrase itself. And apparently a bunch of them didn't like including the word terrible in the phrase. But in 2020 hindsight, it's perfect and it works very well. But I put up here on the screen so you can see just an example of one of the documents that I had to look at. And this one does not appear in the United Negro College Fund collection. So you can't find it at the Library of Congress on my, and you can try after the pandemic conditions are over and we can start doing in-person research again. This was in what I call the G Street collection, which is the Arthur Fletcher papers, which I named after his house on G Street Southwest in Washington, D.C., where he stored them ultimately in his basement, and they remained there for several years after his death before his son brought them to Florida. And so it is technically the property, actually, of the United Negro College Fund, even though they don't know it exists. And one of the things I'm going to be doing on my sabbatical next year is actually getting in touch with them, getting in touch with the National Archives to start to talk about bringing some of these documents back into the possession of their technical rightful owners, in this case, the College Fund. But you can see where he made edits to a speech that he had drafted for the, actually it's not a speech, it's the verbiage that's going to go on the brochure that's to accompany the launch of A Mind is a Terrible Thing to Waste, of the initial campaign back in early 1972. And that launch, in his case, involved giving speeches all over the country in various cities that had HBCUs and also in cities that had folks that he was hoping to get to donate to the fund. And so, you know, with that, I'm at 20 minutes since I started talking, and I've pretty much covered the ground that I wanted to with this introduction, and I hope we can have a rollicking back and forth for discussion for the balance of the hour. Let me stop sharing so it's all of us back here on the screen. And Kristen, I don't know, you're going to call on people, I think, right?
Right. So please, if you do have questions, please post them in the chat, and we will respond to those. David, I guess I can start. I have a question for you. You mentioned the fact that, that Arthur had connections with both Democratic and Republican presidents. Can you say a little bit more about his relationship with LBJ?
Oh, well, he did not have a relationship with LBJ. Of the 5 presidents that I say are the ones he advised, the one Democrat is Bill Clinton.
Okay.
And so, although I personally did research at the LBJ library in research for my first book, which was on the Philadelphia Plan, which is something that very much began in the Johnson administration under the work of Secretary Willard Wirtz, Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz. It's not LBJ, it's Clinton. Okay. And it's a bit of a stretch. I'm aware that I'm making this stretch that to count him as one of the presidents he advised. Fletcher remained the chair of the Civil Rights Commission for the first year or so of the Clinton administration, and then ultimately, as part of the transition, was late. Clinton was well into his presidency at that point. Clinton named our colleague Mary Frances Berry as chair at that point, and Fletcher stepped back and remained on the commission until the expiration of his term in '95.
Okay. In terms, another question for you, in terms of connecting with the family in order to do your research, how did that go about?
So let me see, how did it the earliest moment of it, let me think, because I kind of met all of them around the same time, and I'm thinking it was the summer of 2010. Um, and I'm thinking, you know what, it was actually a colleague who was at Washburn University. They had, the Department of Political Science at Washburn back in 2003 had invited Fletcher over again to his alma mater to do about 2 days of interviews with them. And so at some point, I think in 2010, and this is after Fletcher had died, and I was beginning to work on the project, and I had come across Fletcher in my first project of the dissertation, the book of Constructing Affirmative Action, because he kind of takes the ball and runs with it, to use the sport that was his favorite sport as a metaphor. When the Nixon administration comes in, he picks up where the Labor Department had left off in '68. That professor, the chair of political science, I reached out to him and we started talking about Fletcher. And then he said, well, you need to talk to Phyllis Fletcher, actually, who is a radio personality in Seattle on NPR. And well, let me go ahead and contact Phyllis Fletcher. And I mean, there's, it's a popular name. Actually, at one point during the project, I was thinking about doing a few paragraphs on the name and how it came over to the United States, and ultimately how it moved into the African American community, and then statistics on how popular it is in the African American community, how popular it is in the American community. And but Phyllis is Arthur Fletcher's granddaughter by his youngest son, Philip. One of his granddaughters by Philip. And Phyllis was the first person to tell me about the suicide, which again, because of the dearth of sources here, you kind of have to know that it happened in order to go searching for it, in a sense. And she put me in touch with Paul and Sylvia, her uncle and her aunt, Fletcher's surviving children, and kind of it took off from there.
Okay, and a follow-on, we have a question, and it is the question begins, I'm always fascinated by family members who have family papers. When you met and spoke with the son, did he have plans for the papers or any idea of their importance? This person writes that she's very happy you were glad to help facilitate the scanning.
Thank you. Yeah. So early on in the project, he did not have possession of the papers. They were still in the basement of the G Street house, which had passed into the children and grandchildren, into the hands of the children and grandchildren of Fletcher's second wife. And there, as there are in every family, there were some difficulties and misunderstandings between various sides of the family that they needed to work out. Paul very much understood their importance. Paul had been planning his own biography of his dad over the years. He understood his father's importance to late 20th century civil rights and politics, and wanted to do this. And so as I got to know him, and as I began to win his trust in my my professionalism, really, we started talking. He started talking to me about these papers and where they were, and he started making his own plans to take possession. And he had to explain to the family members who had the house that he felt that the papers belonged in his possession, and that his father would have wanted him to have that. And because again, he was thinking of a biography, and he told them, and I went to the house with him, and I met all these folks. This is a professional historian, and he's also working on my dad. This is a real thing. Can I have the papers so that we can do something with them? And then I wasn't there when it happened, but he got, I guess he got a U-Haul, and because he was living in Hollywood, Florida at the time, and he took them all out of the basement. They had endured about 3 floods between Arthur Fletcher's death in '05 and I think 2012 or 2013 when Paul was able to get them out and bring them to Florida. And then at least when I saw them, at least he had them above ground, because Florida is by no means a dry place either. You know, they're in the back of this truck trailer, you know, basically the part of the 18-wheeler that doesn't include the cab. And that gives them about 5 feet or so if there's going to be any flooding. So they no longer were subject to the flooding. There were various pests in there and they were deteriorating. And ultimately I said to him, look, it's, you know, summer of 2014, I'm going to come down there if it's all right with you. And, you know, let's work together. And we sort of co-owned that project. We went in halves on renting this scanner, and that's an expensive thing, you know, and we had to bring it into the place where we were doing it. We set up in his community. He lived in a retirement community. There was sort of a public room with sort of folding chairs, folding tables and folding chairs. And we set up the equivalent of a reading room like you find in the archive, because we had a team, you know, he and his girlfriend her sons, who were in the local community college, and they were just fascinated by the idea that they could be part of this project. And we brought in other friends, and there were some folks who at the time were thinking about doing a documentary, Fletcher, and they, from where they were in Arizona, they flew out and they filmed us doing this. And I think all the footage has been lost, unfortunately, and that documentary has gone nowhere. But they at some point were looking through the papers just so that they could understand what was happening. So I had them sitting at tables, and I, you know, just from my own experience as a historian, I knew the rules that you have to follow in an archive. And so, you know, I said, all right, this side of the room is where we're going to have lunch every day. And this side of the room is where we're going to keep all the documents, right? And when, you know, never the twain shall part. And, you know, here's the gloves you should be using. And, you know, here's what we're, you know, here's the process, digitization process. And, you know, in retrospect, it was a lot of fun, but it was really, really long days. I was running to make I had to run at the very end to make another comment. And so I had to finally over, and then the scanner died. I mean, it was just like little problems that came up along the way. And, but looking back, you know, what an important experience I think that was for me, and for the, you know, for the papers, because now we have this thing that, I mean, I have it on several thumb drives, and I've transferred it over to the folks at the Washburn Library, the Mabee Library at Washburn, and they're working on the process. But of course, they're understaffed, and then there's coronavirus, and it's just going along very slowly. But I recently learned of another scholar who I think is speaking at the OAH later this month, who's doing something on Arthur Fletcher, and I was able to say, hey, I have all this stuff. Would you like it? You know, just here's. Because, you know, that's what we do, and I'm so glad that I did that, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to do that.
Could you talk a little bit more about how the book was selected to be part of the program at Washburn University?
Thank you. So I read, and I think it's usually written with a lowercase I and a capital R, like as if it's an Apple thing, which it isn't. No affiliation there as far as I know. But I read is a program where it's basically a freshman common read. So they work at that that every freshman then either they're funded to get or they buy as part of a common freshman course. And it also involves a talk. And so I gave a talk like this one for about an hour in September. And then we filmed a Q&A where the students had about a week or so to write questions. And then I responded to them on a Zoom. And in terms of the selection process, I don't know, you know, to the degree to which it's competitive. I know that because of my work with that library to move the documents there, they were very aware of the book. They thought it was an important book because it depicted obviously an alum of their institution who had gone off and done great things, and also because of what the scholarship speaks to. And higher education in Kansas it's one of the places in this country where this sort of thing will resonate. Issues of civil rights and issues of the role of the Republican Party, and the role one plays in the other. And I was really, really flattered at the end. And I hope he wasn't just trying to flatter me, but the dean said it was the second best iRead they've ever seen, iRead presentation they've ever seen in the 12 years of doing it. And I said, oh, that's great. Who was the best iRead presentation? John Lewis, when he was presenting on March. And I thought, wow, that's, talk about a great compliment. You give me all the compliments you want if I'm going to be second to John Lewis, But he, I guess the dean told me about it in last June or thereabouts, that they were considering me for the iRead. And I don't know, again, like I said, I don't know the process where they whittle it down and then make the decision. But it was about mid-July when he said, no, you got it. And now let's figure out whether you're coming in person or via Zoom. And unfortunately, we all know the answer to that question for the past 13 months.
So what are you thinking about for your next book project? Will it be a continuation of your current research, or are you moving in a different direction?
So my sabbatical application that I filled out last September, which has now been approved. So next spring, I thought about doing a couple articles about the process of what I've gone through in the past decade with Fletcher. And I will be, as part of the application, I talked about, as I said earlier, I like to use the word repatriation, the repatriation of documents as appropriate. And so part of it is going to be, and part of that continuing work that I'm doing is working on the Arthur Fletcher papers in one form or another. So the credit on my CV will be something along the lines of editor Arthur Fletcher papers, right? But in terms of my day-to-day research, I've kind of taken a 90-degree turn. I'm a fan of the rock group Journey. And some years back, I had built this, during grad school, I had built this fan website that I, of course, brought professional historical veneer to. And, book, some of you may be familiar with the genre. It's not a very scholarly genre. I read this bio of the band that had been published in 2010 by a British journalist. And I thought, well, gosh, this needs to be done. I care about this. I'm a historian. Let me bring what I have to this table. And so I'm actually, and I'm getting a real kick out of it. I'm working on a history of the band, and the current moment where I'm at, which is still at the very, very beginning, I'm looking at what all the original band members were doing musically before they joined Journey in 1973. A couple of them were in Santana, which some of you may have heard of. One of them worked with Frank Zappa and David Bowie. And so, I'm getting to listen to all this really cool music and call it research, and I guess that's sort of the beauty, I think, of being a tenured full professor, is I can just say, I can just sort of go on this tangent for 6 or 8 months and see if it pans out. And if it doesn't, maybe I'll do something else, maybe not. And so I highly recommend becoming a tenured full professor to anyone who could possibly find the opportunity to do so.
I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to bring it back to Richard Nixon. So what was the most, I guess, surprising thing you learned about Arthur Fletcher's relationship with Richard Nixon, or interactions with Richard Nixon?
I think I froze for the first half, but are you asking me about the most surprising thing?
Most surprising thing, or to flip it on its side, the most Nixonian thing that Nixon would do in his interactions with Fletcher.
Isn't that the thing, though? When we immerse ourselves in a project and we come out on the other side, and we look back, none of it seems surprising. and thought, boy, that's surprising. I think the most surprising thing I learned about Nixon over the course of the past few years was not in my own primary research on Arthur Fletcher, but it was, gosh, why am I blocking on her name? I'm no longer blocking on her name. Wright Rigueur, what is her first? Leah. Leah Wright Rigueur published her dissertation in 2015 or 2016, and it's called The Loneliness of the Black Republican. Fantastic book, by the way. And she talks about Wilt Chamberlain meeting with Richard Nixon. And I guess I can count that as research for me because part of the process is reading secondaries. And this was a secondary that I read. And I mean, mostly I read it to see what she was saying about Fletcher and, also to get leads on other primary sources, right? And see the conclusions she drew. And she does talk about Art Fletcher, but this meeting with Wilt Chamberlain takes place in August of '68 during the campaign. And either Fletcher was there or he also had a meeting with Nixon like right around the same time. I forget exactly which of those two, but so Nixon was, clearly thinking in '68 about the Black vote, and sort of he had just emerged, or I think it was right before primaries were over, so he was in Miami for the convention, and there was still perhaps some lingering doubt as to whether he was going to be the nominee, because George Romney was to the left of him, and Wallace, the other George, was to the right. And I think he was trying to find a way to make sure that he had everything he could possibly have. And Black Republicans, which still exist today, but not to that extent, they existed to a much extent back then. And why not try to pick up their votes? Plus, here's a star basketball player, so let's sit down and chat. I guess that was the most surprising moment in it. In terms of Fletcher himself, it's not so much surprising. When I think of Fletcher's relationship with Nixon, it's really sad and indicative. So it's not of who Nixon was, that Nixon would smile in your face and he would invite you to the second floor of the White House for intimate two-couple dinners, as he did with Fletcher. Fletcher and his second wife, Bernice, were often on the second floor. And then he turns around and fires him because he wants to get what today we would think of as the Trump base, right? He wants to get the white working class. And Fletcher is not, incidentally, Fletcher is not anti-union. Fletcher is anti-racism in unions. And yet sometimes when we fight a battle, and believe me, I know this as faculty senate president, everyone is going to assign whatever feelings they want to assign to you from their own perspective as they fight you in that battle. And so the folks fighting against Fletcher from the union side blasted him as anti-union, and that's ultimately how they got Nixon to fire him. Nixon also on the tapes refers to Fletcher as, this is the, it's typical of Nixon. It's also sabbatical of the day, but he refers to Fletcher as a good political property. I think I'm getting the quote pretty close, but he definitely used the word property, which is really, really wrong to use when we're referring to the grandchildren of slaves, right? And for the president of the United States to do it, and knowing he was being recorded, obviously that's not his most embarrassing moment on the tapes. Certain scandal named after a hotel comes to mind, but so it's yeah. Reading Rigueur in that moment with typical Nixonian moments were the ones that tend to come to my mind more often.
Right. One of our participants on the chat indicates she'd like to hear more about your project with
Journey.
I'm going to throw it out. So you're trying to think of how I want to phrase this. So your fan relationship with Journey, how far back does that go?
First heard Don't Stop Believin' on a jukebox in the Borscht Belt of the lower tier of New York State when I was 11. And it was a quarter that I paid, and there was probably a second song that I was allowed to hear for that price. And just fell in love with the sound. It appealed to me, and started voraciously buying up, with my allowance, every cassette tape I could get on them, which were still preciously few. And then discovered their pre-Steve Perry fusion past, which was just remarkable. I mean, they had gone from this jazz fusion type of music to commercial pop where they're selling out stadiums. And so I decided over time that I was just in love with it all. I mean, every single, some are better than others, but I can listen to any song by them, any song by the spin-off bands they created, anything by them as solo artists. The guitarist is one of the most underappreciated rock guitarists in rock history. Neil Schon is his name. At 15 years old, Carlos Santana and Eric Clapton were fighting over this kid. To be in their groups, and he ultimately chose and Greg Raleigh, the other Santana alum. Both of them are now, of course, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but Greg Raleigh facts. Anything they put out, Greg Raleigh turned more to, he got back into Latin music, Latin rock in the 2000s, and I appreciated all of that. And lately he's been with Star and his all-star band, so I get a kick out of seeing him doing that stuff. But you can all see him in the Woodstock movie. This is Greg Raleigh. He was the lead singer for Santana. So if you ever turn on Black Magic Woman, that's his voice, at least the Santana version. There's a Fleetwood Mac version. And when I went to UVA, I started grad school in 2000. They're students, and I thought, well, why don't I figure out how to create a website? And I knew a little bit about HTML, and I just thought, let me have a little fun here. And some other Journey fans saw this, and then they started giving me stuff to post. And within a couple of years, we had a news feature, we had a reviews feature, an editorials feature where we argued with people who worked for the band. It was quite something, but it was getting in the way, and I wanted to be a scholar of African American political history. And so I had to kind of let it go in terms of things that I would think about on a daily basis. I still kept every year paying for the website to exist, so it still exists. It's up there, you can see it. It's called the Journey Zone, and so it's journey-zone.com. And so that's how I kind of got into that. Yeah.
Well, those on the chat who have been around me long enough know that my area of focus has been the Johnson administration, but I have this secret desire to write an academic history of Sesame Street and the larger children's television workshop, which may or may not happen in retirement. But I'm just putting it out there. So I completely love this idea that you are going to pursue your Journey book. And hopefully you can come back and talk to us.
I'd love to. I don't know how much it connects to the history of the federal government, but I'll never refuse an invitation to talk.
Well, at this point, we do not have any other questions in the chat, but on behalf of President Elizabeth Charles, the rest of the Executive Council, and the wider SHVUG membership, David, I'd like to thank you for your presentation this afternoon. And it was just delightful in so many ways. And we are so glad that you were able to find the time to present in this, our SHVUG Colloquium for 2021, as an outgrowth of the fact that we could not have our in-person SHVUG meeting last year. So thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. And stay tuned. We will have more information coming out from the SHVUG email. Next up at the OAH, we do have some SHVUG sessions, so please be aware of that. And as we move into the summer, will be another issue of the Federalist. We're going to keep going. We're going to keep going through this pandemic. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you later. All right, goodbye.
Hi, Judson. Thank you.